Three children walked onto a beach in Adelaide on a perfect summer morning in 1966. They never came home. For 40 years, the disappearance of Clara, Elsie, and Tommy Morrison became Australia's most baffling mystery. Parents watched their own children a little closer. Police chased thousands of leads that led nowhere. And then, 4 decades later, a demolition crew made a discovery that would finally reveal the horrifying truth. What they found buried beneath that old house changed everything we thought we knew about this case. Keep watching. This story is one of Australia's darkest mysteries, and every detail matters until the very end. Before we begin this investigation, let us know where you're watching from in the comments and subscribe to Seek Stories for more mysterious disappearance stories like this one. January 26, 1966. Australia Day. The scorching summer sun beats down on Glenelg Beach, just 10 kilometers from Adelaide city centre. It's the kind of day that draws families from across South Australia to the pristine white sand and gentle waves of this beloved seaside destination. The beach is alive with holiday energy. Children shriek with delight as they chase waves. Families cluster under colorful umbrellas. The smell of sunscreen and salt air mingles with the distant aroma of fish and chips from the nearby shops. It's Australia at its most innocent, most carefree. At 10 a.m. that morning, Nancy Morrison kisses her 3 children goodbye at their home on Harding Street in nearby Summerton Park. 9-year-old Clara, the responsible older sister with her bright blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. 7-year-old Elsie, more reserved but fiercely loyal to her siblings. And 4-year-old Tommy, the baby of the family with an infectious giggle and boundless energy. Be good for Clara, Nancy tells the younger two as she hands Clara enough money for bus fare and ice cream. And make sure you're back by 2 o'clock for lunch. It's a routine they've followed dozens of times before. The children are experienced beachgoers. Clara knows the bus routes like the back of her hand. They're responsible kids from a loving family in a safe community where neighbors look out for each other and children roam freely. The Morrison children board the 10 a.m. bus from Glenelg Station, chattering excitedly about their day ahead. The bus driver, who knows them as regulars, exchanges friendly greetings. Other passengers smile at the well-behaved siblings who always say please and thank you. At Glenelg Beach, the morning unfolds exactly as planned. The children claim their favorite spot near the surf club, spread out their towel, and dive into their beach day ritual. Clara, ever the protective older sister, keeps a watchful eye on Tommy while he builds sandcastles. Elsie, somewhere between her older sister's responsibility and her younger brother's carefree nature, moves between helping with the sandcastles and joining Clara in the deeper water. But around 11:30 a.m., something changes. Multiple witnesses would later report seeing the 3 Morrison children in the company of a tall, blond man in his 40s. The man appears comfortable around children, engaging them in conversation and games. Most remarkably, the children seemed completely at ease with him. This wasn't a stranger danger situation. This was something far more sinister. Mrs. Olive Stratton, who was at the beach with her own children, watched the scene unfold with growing curiosity. The man seemed to know them well, she would later tell police. The children were laughing and playing with him like he was a family friend. The older girl, Clara, was completely relaxed around him, which is what struck me as odd because she was usually so protective of the younger ones. Another witness, Mr. Gordon Strops, noticed the man playing with the children in the water. He was teaching the boy to swim, Strops recalled. The children were having a wonderful time. There was nothing that seemed wrong or out of place. If anything, I remember thinking what a good father he seemed to be. But here's the chilling detail that would haunt investigators for decades. The children had never mentioned knowing any adult male friend. Their family was small and tight-knit. Their father, Grant Morrison, worked for a postal services company and was well known in their community. Every adult in their lives was accounted for. So who was this mysterious man who seemed to have such an easy relationship with 3 careful, well-raised children? As the morning progressed into afternoon, more witnesses reported seeing the man and the 3 children together. They were observed at the nearby bakery, where the man purchased meat pies and drinks for all 4 of them. The shopkeeper, Mr. Wenzel Kramer, remember the interaction clearly because the man paid with a large note and told the children to buy whatever you'd like. The man seemed generous, kind even, Kramer would later tell investigators. The children were polite and well-behaved. The little boy, Tommy, was shy at first, but the older girls seemed completely comfortable. Clara even thanked the man for treating them. This detail sent chills through the investigation team. The children had been given money by their mother for ice cream. They had no need for an adult stranger to buy them lunch. Yet here they were, accepting food from someone who, according to their family, they had never met before. The timeline becomes crucial here. At approximately 1 p.m., just 1 hour before they were supposed to catch the bus home, the children were seen walking north along Jetty Road with the mysterious man. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Clara, Elsie, and Tommy Morrison. At 2 p.m., Nancy Morrison began preparing lunch, glancing frequently at the clock. Her children were always punctual, especially Clara, who took her responsibilities as the eldest very seriously. When 2:30 came and went with no sign of them, Nancy felt the first flutter of concern. By 3 p.m., concern had turned to worry. Nancy called her husband Grant at work, hoping against hope that perhaps the children had decided to visit him. They hadn't. Grant immediately left work and rushed to Glenelg Beach, his mind racing through all the possible explanations for their delay. The beach was still crowded with Australia Day holiday makers, but there was no sign of his 3 children. Grant searched every corner of the beach, asked other families if they'd seen them, checked with the surf lifesavers. Nothing. The children seemed to have vanished completely. By 4 p.m., Grant and Nancy contacted the police. Detective Sergeant Lionel Lawson arrived at Glenelg Beach within 30 minutes of the call. A veteran investigator with over 15 years of experience, Lawson had handled missing children cases before, but usually they involved toddlers who had wandered off or teenagers who had lost track of time. 3 responsible children disappearing simultaneously in broad daylight from a crowded public beach was unprecedented. "Tell me everything about today," Lawson said gently, notebook in hand as he interviewed the increasingly frantic parents. Nancy recounted the morning routine, the money she'd given Clara, their planned return time. Grant described his fruitless search of the beach and nearby areas. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the scope of the search expanded dramatically. Police officers were joined by surf lifesavers, local volunteers, and other families from beach. They combed every inch of Glenelg and the surrounding areas, checking changing rooms, shops, the nearby amusement park, and every possible place 3 children might have gone. But it was the witness interviews that began to paint the most disturbing picture. Mrs. Stratton came forward first, describing the tall, blond man she'd seen with the children. Then Mr. Strops added his account of watching the man teach Tommy to swim. The bakery owner provided details about the lunch purchase. Slowly, investigators began to realize they weren't dealing with children who had simply wandered off or had an accident. This was something far more sinister. Detective Lawson established a timeline based on witness statements. The children had been seen with the mysterious man from approximately 11:30 a.m. until 1 p.m. Multiple witnesses confirmed that the children appeared happy, comfortable, and completely willing to be in his company. There were no signs of distress, no indication of coercion or force. This wasn't a random abduction, Lawson noted in his report. The children's behavior suggests they knew this man, or at least believed they knew him. The level of trust they displayed is not typical of children interacting with a complete stranger. As darkness fell on January 26, 1966, the Morrison children had been missing for over 6 hours. The initial search had yielded no trace of them beyond the witness sightings with the unidentified man. What had started as a perfect Australia Day had become every parent's worst nightmare. The investigation was just beginning, and it would consume the attention of Australian law enforcement for the next 4 decades. News of the missing Morrison children spread across Adelaide overnight, and by January 27th, it had become front-page news throughout Australia. The combination of 3 young children, a popular holiday destination, and the mysterious circumstances of their disappearance captured the nation's attention in a way that few missing persons cases ever had. Detective Sergeant Lawson found himself leading what would become one of the largest missing persons investigations in Australian history. The South Australia Police Department pulled investigators from across the state to join the search effort. The Royal Australian Air Force provided helicopters to scan the coastline and inland areas. Volunteer searchers came from neighboring states. The investigation's first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Nancy Morrison, desperate to understand what had happened to her children, began her own inquiries in the neighborhood around Glenelg Beach. She knocked on doors, spoke with shopkeepers, and questioned anyone who spent time in the area regularly. It was during these conversations that a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Mrs. Jean Thwaites, who ran a small cafe near the beach, remembered seeing a tall, blond man in the area multiple times over the previous few weeks. He wasn't a regular, but I'd noticed him because he seemed to spend a lot of time watching families with children, she told Nancy. He never caused any trouble, but there was something about the way he observed people that struck me as odd. Similar reports came from other business owners and regular beachgoers. The mysterious man hadn't been a one-time visitor to Glenelg. He'd been there repeatedly, always alone, always watching families with children. Detective Lawson realized they were dealing with something far more calculated than a crime of opportunity. This man had been stalking the area, possibly for weeks, studying the routines and behaviors of local families. The police artist worked with witnesses to create a composite sketch of the suspect. The image showed a man in his 40s with blonde hair, an athletic build, and what witnesses described as a friendly, approachable appearance. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, and had the kind of demeanor that would put children at ease. This individual has clearly had experience gaining the trust of children, noted Dr. Margaret Williams, a criminal psychologist brought in to consult on the case. The children's behavior suggests they believe they knew him or had been conditioned to trust him through previous interactions. This observation led to a chilling realization. If the children had been comfortable enough with the man to accept food and spend hours in his company, it was possible they had encountered him before without their parents' knowledge. The investigation expanded to include a detailed examination of the Morrison family's routines and activities. Had the man been watching them at their home, at school, during previous visits to the beach? The possibilities were endless and terrifying. Grant and Nancy Morrison found themselves reliving every detail of their children's lives, searching for any clue about when and where this predator might have first made contact with Clara, Elsie, and Tommy. Meanwhile, the physical search continued with unprecedented intensity. Police divers explored every waterway within 50 kilometers of Glenelg. Search and rescue teams combed through the Adelaide hills, checking abandoned buildings, mine shafts, and any location where 3 children might be hidden. The Australian public became obsessed with the case. Tips poured in from across the country, each one investigated thoroughly despite the enormous drain on police resources. Psychics offered their services. Amateur detectives developed elaborate theories. The reward fund, initially established by the South Australia Police, grew to become one of the largest in Australian history as donations poured in from concerned citizens. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, the harsh reality began to set in. Despite the largest search operation in South Australian history, despite thousands of man-hours of investigation, despite the intense public attention and massive reward fund, there was no trace of Clara, Elsie, and Tommy Morrison beyond those final sightings on Australia Day. The case began to take its toll on everyone involved. Detective Lawson, who had initially approached the investigation with professional optimism, found himself haunted by the 3 missing children. He kept their school photos on his desk and thought about them every day. The lack of progress wasn't due to lack of effort or resources. It was due to the complete absence of any trail to follow. Nancy and Grant Morrison aged visibly as the months passed. They maintained hope publicly, appearing on television appeals and cooperating with every new investigative approach the police suggested. Privately, they struggled with guilt, fear, and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their children. The case affected the entire community of Adelaide. Parents began keeping their children closer. The carefree atmosphere that had characterized places like Glenelg Beach changed permanently. The innocence of 1960s Australia had been shattered by the realization that predators could operate in plain sight, even in the safest of communities. As 1966 came to an end, the active investigation began to wind down. Not because the police had given up, but because they had exhausted every lead, followed every tip, and searched every possible location. The case remained officially open, but the day-to-day intensive effort had to be redirected to other matters. The Morrison children had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. For the next 40 years, the Morrison children case became Australia's most famous unsolved mystery. It spawned books, documentaries, television specials, and countless theories from amateur investigators. Every few years, new developments would briefly reignite public interest and police activity. In the 1970s, there were reported sightings of the children in various locations across Australia. Each report was investigated thoroughly, but none proved credible. The children would have been teenagers by then, and the age progressions created by police artists bore little resemblance to the individuals reported in these sightings. The 1980s brought advances in forensic science that prompted police to re-examine all the physical evidence from a case. Hair samples, clothing fibers, and other materials were subjected to new testing methods, but yielded no new leads. The lack of physical evidence remained the investigation's greatest obstacle. Detective Sergeant Lawson retired in 1985, but he never stopped thinking about the Morrison children. He kept copies of all the case files in his home study and continued to review them regularly, hoping that fresh eyes might spot something that had been missed in the initial investigation. Those 3 children haunted me for my entire career, Lawson reflected in a 1995 interview. Not a day went by that I didn't think about Clara, Elsie, and Tommy. What happened to them? Were they buried? Did they suffer? These are questions that kept me awake at night for decades. The case had a profound impact on Australian society that extended far beyond law enforcement. The term stranger danger entered common usage as parents struggled to balance their children's freedom with safety concerns. Playgrounds that had once been filled with unsupervised children became places where parents maintained constant vigilance. Nancy and Grant Morrison became reluctant celebrities, advocates for missing children, and symbols of parental grief. They appeared at conferences, supported legislative changes to improve missing persons investigations, and provided comfort to other families dealing with similar tragedies. But the toll of 40 years without answers was devastating. Grant Morrison died in 1995, having never learned what happened to his children. Nancy continued to live in the same house on Harding Street, maintaining her children's bedrooms exactly as they had been on that January morning in 1966. The case influenced changes in police procedures, the establishment of better coordination between jurisdictions, and the development of improved communication systems for missing persons cases. The Morrison children's disappearance became a catalyst for modernizing how Australia handles child abduction cases. New detectives would occasionally take over the case file, bringing fresh perspectives and modern investigative techniques to bear on the decades-old evidence. DNA testing, computer databases, and improved communication networks offered new hope, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. There simply wasn't enough evidence to follow. The reward fund continued to grow, reaching over $1 million by the early 2000s. Tips still came in regularly, though less frequently than in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. Each tip was still investigated, but the pattern was always the same. Initial hope followed by dead ends and disappointment. As the case approached its 40th anniversary in 2006, it seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. The original witnesses had aged, some had died, and memories had faded. The mysterious blonde man, if still alive, would have been in his 80s. The children, if somehow still alive, would have been adults with children of their own. The consensus among law enforcement was that the Morrison children had been murdered shortly after their abduction, their bodies disposed of in a location that had never been discovered despite decades of searching. It was a grim conclusion, but one that seemed supported by the complete absence of any credible evidence that they had survived. And then, in 2010, everything changed. The breakthrough in the Morrison children case came from an entirely unexpected source: urban development. In March 2010, the Adelaide City Council approved the demolition of several old properties in the suburb of Casterton, about 15 kilometers northeast of Glenelg Beach. The area was being redeveloped for modern housing, and many of the existing structures dated back to the 1950s and 1960s. One of these properties at 47 Maple Street had been owned by a man named Robert "Bob" Henderson, who had died in 1994. Henderson had been a bachelor who worked as an electrical contractor throughout the Adelaide region. After his death, the property had passed to a distant nephew who lived overseas and had simply let it sit vacant for 16 years rather than deal with the expense of maintenance or sale. The demolition crew from Hartwell Construction began work on the Henderson property on March 15, 2010. The house itself was unremarkable: a modest single-story brick home with a small front yard and a larger backyard that was overgrown with weeds and volunteer trees after years of neglect. It was the backyard that would change everything. While clearing the overgrown vegetation, crew member Danny Walsh noticed that the ground in one corner of the yard seemed different from the rest. The soil was softer, darker, and unlike the clay-heavy earth that characterized most of the property. Something didn't feel right about that spot, Walsh later told investigators. After 20 years in construction, you develop an instinct for things that are out of place. The ground there had definitely been disturbed at some point, then left to settle over many years. Walsh brought his concerns to the site foreman, Trevor Mills, who decided to investigate further. Using a ground-penetrating radar unit that the company employed for checking underground utilities, they scanned the suspicious area of the backyard. The results were immediately concerning. The radar indicated multiple anomalies in the soil approximately 3 feet below the surface, in an area roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. The anomalies appeared to be solid objects of varying sizes, arranged in a way that didn't match natural soil patterns. Mills immediately contacted the Adelaide Police Department. Given the location and the nature of the discovery, Detective Inspector Sarah Chun was assigned to the case. Chun, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience, was well aware of the Morrison children case and its significance in South Australian criminal history. When I got the call about potential human remains being discovered in a backyard, the Morrison case wasn't my first thought, Chun later reflected. But when I learned the property owner had died in 1994 and had been living there since the early 1960s, the timeline immediately caught my attention. The excavation of the Henderson backyard began on March 18, 2010, under the supervision of forensic anthropologists from the University of Adelaide. The work was painstakingly slow, with every shovelful of soil carefully examined and documented. On the afternoon of March 19th, the excavation team made their first significant discovery: a child's shoe, a small white sandal that appeared to have been buried for decades. The shoe matched the description of footwear that Elsie Morrison had been wearing on January 26, 1966. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team and the Adelaide Police Department. Within hours, the excavation had been expanded into a full-scale forensic operation. Anthropologists, forensic experts, and senior detectives worked around the clock to carefully uncover what lay beneath the Henderson backyard. Over the next 3 days, the excavation revealed a horrifying truth that had been hidden for 44 years. The remains of 3 children were discovered buried in carefully constructed graves. The bodies had been wrapped in plastic sheeting and buried with personal items that helped establish their identities. Along with Elsie's sandal, investigators found Tommy's distinctive toy truck, the one he had carried with him everywhere, and Clara's bracelet, a gift from her grandmother that she never removed. But it was the DNA evidence that provided absolute confirmation of what everyone involved already suspected. Samples taken from the remains were compared with DNA provided by Nancy Morrison and surviving relatives of the children's father. The results were conclusive. These were the remains of Clara, Elsie, and Tommy Morrison. After 44 years, the mystery of what had happened to the Morrison children had finally been solved. But the discovery also raised new questions about Robert Henderson and his connection to one of Australia's most infamous crimes. The investigation into Robert Henderson's background began immediately following the discovery of the children's remains. Detective Inspector Chin assembled a team of investigators to examine every aspect of Henderson's life, looking for clues about how and why he had been involved in the Morrison children's disappearance. What they discovered painted a picture of a predator who had hidden in plain sight for decades. Robert Henderson had moved to Adelaide in 1961, 5 years before the Morrison children disappeared. He had come from Brisbane, where he had worked for an electrical company. His employment records showed steady work history and no criminal convictions, but deeper investigation revealed a more troubling pattern. In Brisbane, Henderson had been the subject of complaints from parents who felt uncomfortable with his interactions with their children. As an electrical contractor, he often worked in family homes, and several customers had reported that he showed unusual interest in their children's schedules, activities, and routines. He always asked too many questions, recalled Mrs. Patricia Stone, whose Brisbane home Henderson had rewired in 1959. He wanted to know when the children came home from school, where they played, who their friends were. At the time, I thought he was just being friendly, but it made me uncomfortable enough that I made sure I was always home when he was working. The complaints had never risen to the level of formal accusations or police involvement, but they had been sufficient for Henderson's employer to quietly encourage him to seek work elsewhere. His move to Adelaide in 1961 appeared to have been motivated by the need for a fresh start away from growing suspicions about his behavior. In Adelaide, Henderson had established himself as a reliable electrical contractor, working throughout the southern suburbs, including the Glenelg area. His work records showed that he had performed electrical work at dozens of homes near Glenelg Beach in the years leading up to the Morrison children's disappearance. Most significantly, investigators discovered that Henderson had done electrical work at 3 homes on Harding Street, the same street where the Morrison family lived in late 1965 and early January 1966, just weeks before the children disappeared. This explains how he knew the children, Detective Inspector Chin noted in her report. Henderson had been in their neighborhood, possibly observing their routines, learning about their family, and establishing himself as a familiar presence in their lives. The investigation revealed Henderson's methodology was both patient and calculated. Rather than approaching children as a complete stranger, he had established himself as a background presence in their community. The children might have seen him working in neighbors' houses, encountered him in the local shops, or observe him around the neighborhood enough times to recognize him as someone who belonged in their world. This explained why Clara, Elsie, and Tommy had appeared so comfortable with Henderson at Glenelg Beach. He wasn't a stranger to them. He was someone they recognized, someone who had carefully cultivated a sense of familiarity without ever directly introducing himself to their parents. The forensic examination of the Henderson property revealed additional evidence of his crimes. Investigators found children's clothing and toys buried in various locations around the yard, suggesting that the Morrison children might not have been his only victims. DNA testing of these items, compared against missing persons cases from the 1960s and 1970s, identified the remains and belongings of 2 other children who had disappeared from Adelaide area beaches in the years following the Morrison case. Jennifer Walsh, age 6, had disappeared from Brighton Beach in August 1967. Michael Roberts, age 8, had vanished from Henley Beach in November 1969. Both cases had been investigated extensively at the time, but without the connection to Henderson, police had never been able to solve them. We now believe Robert Henderson was responsible for at least 5 child murders over a period of several years, Detective Inspector Chin announced at a press conference in April 2010. His method was consistent. He would establish himself as a familiar presence in communities near popular family beaches, gain the trust of children by appearing to be someone who belonged in their world, and then exploit that trust to lure them away from safe public spaces. The investigation also revealed how Henderson had managed to avoid detection for so many decades. After each crime, he would alter his appearance slightly, sometimes growing or shaving his beard, changing his hairstyle, or wearing different styles of clothing. He moved frequently, never staying in one location long enough for patterns of behavior to become obvious to neighbors or law enforcement. Most cunningly, Henderson had deliberately chosen victims from different police jurisdictions. The Morrison children had disappeared from Glenelg under the jurisdiction of the South Australia Police. Jennifer Walsh's disappearance from Brighton Beach had been investigated by a different local department. Michael Roberts' case at Henley Beach had been handled by yet another agency. In the 1960s and 1970s, communication between law enforcement agencies was limited. There was no centralized database of missing children cases, no system for identifying patterns across jurisdictional boundaries. Henderson had exploited these gaps in communication to operate undetected for years. He was intelligent, patient, and systematic, noted Dr. Robert Phillips, a criminal psychologist who studied the case. Henderson understood how law enforcement operated and deliberately structured his crimes to exploit weaknesses in the system. This wasn't impulsive behavior. It was calculated predation carried out over many years. The forensic examination of the Henderson property continued for months as investigators worked to uncover all evidence of his crimes. The backyard revealed what appeared to be a carefully planned disposal site, with multiple burial locations that had been prepared in advance and used over a period of several years. The resolution of the Morrison children case after 44 years had profound effects on multiple levels. For the surviving family members, for the Adelaide community, for Australian law enforcement, and for the broader understanding of how predators operate in society. For Nancy Morrison, then 85 years old, the discovery brought a complex mixture of closure and renewed grief. After nearly half a century of not knowing what had happened to her children, she finally had answers, but those answers confirmed her worst fears. Part of me always held on a hope that maybe they had survived somehow, that they might still come home, Nancy said in her only public statement following the discovery. Now I know they never suffered for long, and they were together at the end. That brings me some peace, even though my heart is broken all over again. Nancy Morrison passed away peacefully in 2012, just 2 years after learning the truth about her children's fate. She was buried in the same cemetery where Clara, Elsie, and Tommy were finally laid to rest in 2011, following the completion of the forensic investigation. The case had a lasting impact on missing children investigations in Australia. The gaps in communication and coordination that had allowed Henderson to operate across multiple jurisdictions were addressed through the establishment of national databases and improved interagency cooperation. The Australian Federal Police created the National Missing Persons Coordination Centre in 2011, partly in response to lessons learned from the Morrison case and other similar investigations. The center maintains a comprehensive database of missing persons cases and provides coordination support for investigations that cross state boundaries. The Morrison children's case taught us that predators don't respect jurisdictional boundaries, so our response can't be limited by those boundaries either, noted AFP Commissioner Anthony Burns at the center's opening ceremony. The case also influenced changes in how law enforcement approaches community-based predators. Henderson's method of establishing familiarity with potential victims before approaching them became a recognized pattern that investigators are now trained to identify. Child safety education programs were updated to include information about trusted strangers, individuals who might appear familiar or safe to children because they have been observed in the community, but who are not actually known to the family. Detective Inspector Sarah Chun, who led the investigation that finally solved the case, reflected on its broader significance during her retirement ceremony in 2018. The Morrison case reminds us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. Robert Henderson appeared to be a normal, hardworking member of society. He had no criminal record, held steady employment, and lived quietly in residential neighborhoods. But he was a calculating predator who destroyed multiple families and terrorized an entire community. The case also shows us the importance of never giving up. 44 years is a long time to wait for answers, but advances in forensic science and the diligent work of construction crews uncovering old properties gave us the break we needed to finally solve this case. The Henderson property became the subject of extensive forensic archaeology as investigators worked to ensure that all evidence had been recovered and that no other victims remained undiscovered. The work continued for over 2 years, with ground-penetrating radar and other advanced techniques used to examine every square meter of the property. In total, investigators confirmed that Henderson had been responsible for the murders of 5 children between 1966 and 1971. The Morrison children were his first known victims, but the evidence suggested that he had continued killing for several years before either stopping his activities or moving away from Adelaide. The question of why Henderson's crimes had ended remained unanswered. His death in 1994 from natural causes meant that many questions about his motivations and methods would never be fully resolved. There was no confession, no explanation, no insight into the mind of the man who had terrorized families and communities for decades. The case files were finally closed in 2013, more than 47 years after Clara, Elsie, and Tommy Morrison had walked on a Glenelg beach for the last time. The investigation had consumed thousands of hours of police work, involved dozens of investigators, and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in resources. But for the families involved, no amount of time or money could restore what had been lost. The Morrison children case became a permanent part of Australian criminal history, a reminder of the darkness that can exist beneath the surface of seemingly safe communities. Thanks for watching until the end. It really means a lot. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what stood out to you most. And of course, make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. See you soon.